If you're tired of these promos, supporters get the podcast early and ad-free. Just go to donate.bogosity.tv for the links to sign up. Welcome to the Bogosity Podcast for the week of January 15, 2023. The podcast that ran off with a preacher's daughter. This is your host, Shane Killian. Let's calicate the news of the bogus. So you remember how the left and the news media made such a huge deal about the documents taken at the FBI's raid of Mar-a-Lago? We covered how all of the excuses of them being nuclear codes or whatever all fizzled, and they ended up being pretty much what Trump said they were, official records from his time as president. Trump, like all presidents, was allowed to declare those to be personal records and take them home under the Presidential Records Act. Note that this does not extend to the vice president. They have to abide by the Federal Records Act, and they do not have the power to declassify documents or declare them personal records and take them with them when they leave office. But that's exactly what Joe Biden did when he left the VP's office in January of 2017. One trove of classified documents was found in a locked closet at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, in an office he hasn't used in almost 3 years. Unlike the documents possessed by Trump, the documents Biden kept include sensitive compartmented information, or SCI, meaning the information came from intelligence sources. They include intelligence memos and other materials concerning Iran, Ukraine, and the UK. Biden said he was surprised to learn they were there. So he doesn't even remember taking them? Remember that after the Mar-a-Lago raid, Biden said, quote, "How could that possibly happen? How anyone could be that irresponsible?" And I thought, what data was in there that may compromise sources and methods? By that I mean names of people who helped or etc. And it's just totally irresponsible. Oh, and by the way, they were found 6 days before the midterm election, but were kept secret from us until now. Because of course they were. 2 days after the White House acknowledged the existence of the documents, the second trove was found in Joe Biden's garage where he keeps his Corvette. And, last minute addition, there's been at least one classified document found at one of Biden's residences. No details so far, this is very much a developing story, but man, this thing is far from over. At the very least, this has taken the wind out of the Trump investigation, which seems to have fizzled anyway. Maybe this is why? The House Oversight Committee is launching an investigation into the documents, including why the initial discovery wasn't immediately made public. Rules for thee, not for me. Oh, I have a feeling this will be another one to keep an eye on. Keep the popcorn handy. If you're looking for a way to support this channel, but you don't have any spare cash and you can't stand ads, you can do so by generating your own cryptocurrency. Use the links at the bottom of the description to follow the link to Odysee.com to listen to the podcast and see all of my YouTube videos as well. Just watching videos will produce cryptocurrency for the creator and yourself. And since Odysee is always monetized and never censored, you'll have no problem seeing all the videos from your favorite creators. You can also use the library credits you create at Odysee to tip creators and even purchase paid content. Earn library credits through various rewards, including daily view rewards and the number of shares and invites. And you can interact with creators in all sorts of ways, including like and dislike, comment, boost a post by supporting it, repost it, and share to other sites, all while earning crypto for the creator. Easily monetize yourself and your favorite creators using cryptocurrency, without advertising. Use the link below to visit this channel on Odysee.com and see many of your other favorites there as well. Okay, time to get a little more serious. Over the course of this podcast, we've covered the attempts to execute innocent people in Texas, Oklahoma, and Arkansas, a couple of which were carried out. Now, Texas is trying to do it again with Arely Escobar, who, in 2011, was sentenced for murder based on faulty DNA testing by a lab that has been completely discredited. Even though prosecutors agree his conviction should be thrown out, the state of Texas is still trying to execute him. Unbelievable. He was convicted of the rape and murder of 17-year-old Bianca Hernandez, who lived in his apartment complex, based on DNA evidence a district court judge ruled was scientifically unreliable from a lab that was later closed down due to untrained staff and improper testing procedures. In 2016, the Austin Police Department was forced to shut down its entire crime lab after the Texas Forensic Science Commission found issues across the board with its DNA testing. The lab was using outdated methods and obsolete interpretations of test results, and it failed to document and correct for contaminated samples. Some of the analysts didn't even have a scientific background. Apparently, they were just LARPing. But the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals disagreed with the lower court and even the DA, saying that Escobar didn't show they had messed up his case specifically, even though it was from the same lab during the same time period as these improper practices. Fortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court has stepped in and said that, no, when it's a death penalty case, simply the fact that the state can no longer support its conviction is all you need. This isn't the first time they've done this. In the case of Bobby Moore, the U.S. Supreme Court found him to be intellectually disabled and therefore ineligible for the death penalty, a position that DA Kim Hogg supported. But they still found him eligible for execution. The Supreme Court had to step in again in 2019 and give a more forceful ruling, and Moore was finally granted parole in 2020. In a concurrence, Justice Roberts wrote, "On remand, the court repeated the same errors that this court previously condemned, if not quite in haec verba, certainly in substance. The court repeated its improper reliance on the factors articulated in Ex parte Briseno, and again emphasized Moore's adaptive strengths rather than his deficits. That did not pass muster under this court's analysis last time. It still doesn't." Back to Escobar, his brief to the court read in part, "The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals stepped outside of the judicial role by sustaining the conviction on the basis of arguments no party made, reaching a result no party advocated, and in the process took upon itself the role of the prosecutor to decide whether the evidence was reliable enough to warrant the state convicting and executing petitioner." The Supreme Court agreed. And good on Travis County District Attorney Jose Garza for having the integrity we see far too few DAs display. He said, quote, "It is undeniable that the jury in this case was told things that ended up not being accurate. We believe it's really important for someone accused of a crime to have a jury that has access to complete and accurate facts." And that should always be the case. Enough of this crap about he has to show remorse for something he never did, or he got a fair trial. If there's any problem with the evidence or witnesses, the defendant should always have the benefit of the doubt. At the very least, how about not killing them? So hopefully this will be the start of a trend. If you're on the Wi-Fi in a coffee shop or hotel, anyone on that network can get your traffic. Do you really trust all of those strangers? For that matter, do you really trust your ISP? A VPN can protect you from prying eyes, disguise your location, and even foil government censors. It's essential in this day and age, so go to vpn.bogosity.tv and you'll be taken to BoxPN. Starting at just $2.99 a month, you can get unlimited high-speed connections to VPN servers all over the world, and they don't log connections, so your privacy is assured. Traveling abroad, just VPN home, and don't worry about what those other governments are doing. Back at home, stop your ISP from traffic shaping and messing with the quality internet access you're paying good money for. You can connect from multiple machines at once, including your smartphone or tablet, and it supports all the secure standards, including OpenVPN and SSTP. Bypass censors and surveillance with your own secure VPN connection. Go to vpn.bogosity.tv. And another story of injustice, and sadly one that we don't yet see the Supreme Court putting a stop to, is that of keeping suspects in pre-trial detention due to poverty. We've covered all the problems with the Bail Reform Act, but at least it has a clause that says, quote, "The judicial officer may not impose a financial condition that results in the pre-trial detention of the person." In other words, you can't just say a poor person has to pay $20 zillion bail knowing that they can't pay and will have to stay in jail. Remember, this is pre-trial detention, which means innocent people in jail. You're innocent until proven guilty, and since they haven't been proven guilty yet, they are innocent. Bail is only supposed to be there to ensure the person will show up for trial. The Bail Reform Act did a lot of terrible things by basically making it a punishment for merely being accused of certain crimes, on the assumption that the suspect is somehow a danger to society because of the alleged offense. But when you go beyond even that, it's head-shaking. According to a report from the Federal Criminal Justice Clinic, the justice system is a, quote, "culture of detention," where it's more about locking people up than it is about actual justice. Quote, "Federal judges routinely violate the very bail laws that they are tasked with upholding, which drives up detention rates, jails people for poverty, and exacerbates racial disparities. Court-watching data and first-hand accounts from judges and lawyers reveal that a culture of detention pervades federal courtrooms. Courthouse custom overrides the written law, eroding the presumption of innocence." And in this particular article from Eugene Volokh, one culprit is something we've talked about quite a few times on this podcast, using bail as punishment. Our court-watching study shows that federal judges consistently impose financial conditions of release that result in pretrial detention. This practice violates the explicit statutory language of the Bail Reform Act, perpetuates a system where wealth buys release and people are jailed for poverty, and has a disproportionate racial impact. These detentions, which violate the law, contribute to rising detention rates as well as racial and socioeconomic disparities in the federal system. Again, the only legitimate reason for bail, as was the case for 1,000 years, was to ensure the person would show up for trial, which most people will. Most people aren't going to want to choose a life on the lam rather than 6 months for a misdemeanor or something. And especially since, as we covered, pretrial detention increases the chances of recidivism after they complete their sentence. So almost everyone should be released on their own recognizance. But in 37% of cases, 127 out of 343, judges imposed financial conditions on release. In 116 of those cases, judges required a secure bond that, 36% of the time, defendants didn't have the financial means to meet. Quote, "For these individuals, the financial conditions acted as de facto detention orders in violation of the law." And as we covered in the past, they have data showing the racial disparities. Quote, "People of color are less likely to meet financial requirements. It is striking that in 95% of cases in our study where a secure bond was imposed, the arrestee was a person of color. Moreover, in every single case in our study where a corporate security bond was imposed, the arrestee was a person of color." Let's cover a couple of terms. A secured bond is one that's backed up by a specific asset, usually cash, although if they have something of equal value like a car or a house, they can put it up as a collateral. A corporate security bond is a much more troubling idea. As the report describes it, quote, "When a CSB is purchased, the bail bond company signs a contract with family members or friends and charges a non-refundable fee, which in federal court is typically between 10 and 15% of the full bail amount. The cosigners are often required to post property or other assets as collateral, sometimes in amounts totaling 150% of the bail amount. If the arrestee violates the terms of release or fails to appear in court, the person who signed the contract is responsible for paying the full bail amount and forfeits the collateral." According to a review done by Color of Change and the ACLU, many bail bond contracts include additional fees and conditions that are difficult for the arrestee and their cosigners to meet. Many people are left with loan installments and fees well after a case is resolved. Bail bond companies are often predatory and charge extremely high interest rates. Indigent people must then choose between staying in jail or taking on significant debt to secure their freedom. And to make matters worse, even if the judge has found that the person is eligible for release, they stay in jail until they've met their burden of proving they can cover the bond. Two things need to happen. First, all of the parts of the Bail Reform Act that deal with so-called protecting the community need to go. If nothing else, judges can ignore that part of the law as it isn't really a requirement of them and it's unconstitutional anyway. Second, judges need to start looking at defendants as individuals and look at each individual situation, especially their financial circumstances. They need to consider both that the person has the means to meet the bail condition and if that condition might result in the defendant's detention. And finally, they need to consider all sorts of things other than bail. There are many alternatives which generally end up being more effective at ensuring the defendant will appear in court while also discouraging them from reoffending while on release. Things like wearing an ankle monitor, body-worn cameras, pretrial services such as drug rehabilitation, court call reminders, check-ins. Basically anything they can use to enforce parole can apply to pretrial release. Judges who refuse to do any of this have no business wearing the robe. It all ends up being a prison utilization program, not a justice system.
Do you have children, or nieces or nephews? Are you homeschooling, or just want to counter some of the socialist indoctrination most children get in school? If so, go to bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins, and you'll be taken to a website where you can get some great books for elementary-age children. The Tuttle Twins books are books about liberty and free market economics that include children's versions of Bastiat's The Law, Leonard Read's I, Pencil, and Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, as well as books about the Federal Reserve and how regulations protect business cronies. They'll learn about the harm caused by eminent domain, or regulations passed in the name of safety, and fundamental concepts of liberty. And as you can see from the sample pages on the website, they're all easy to read and nicely illustrated. They're just $9.99 a piece, or get a special discount as well as free bonuses when you purchase all 5. You can even buy in bulk to donate to schools and local libraries. So get the Tuttle Twins books at bogosity.tv/TuttleTwins.
And now it's time to super-ionize this week's biggest bogon emitter. With a hilariously narcissistic display of cheering and high-fiving, Illinois politicians, who remain protected by armed security at taxpayer expense, just banned the sale or possession of so-called assault weapons. What exactly they are is anyone's guess. Since the law is written by people who are completely ignorant of guns, it'll be one of those "we'll have to wait until the court cases to figure out what it means" deals. It's the typical laundry list of meaningless restrictions: pistol grip, folding or telescoping stock, flash suppressors, basically the things I listed in my video Assault Weapons versus Assault Rifles. Of course, they call it the Protect Illinois Communities Act. Of course, it won't do anything of the kind. It doesn't really do anything to stop a criminal bent on mayhem, even if his gun does comply with this law. But as we've covered, its blatantly ableist restrictions will make it difficult for smaller, weaker, or disabled people to have a firearm they can actually use to defend themselves. It also includes the 10-round magazine limit, which means that, given the number of rounds generally required to stop a home invader, if you're invaded by 3 criminals, you're screwed. And, just to remind you, more people are killed with hands and feet than rifles of all kinds. More people are killed with blunt objects than rifles of all kinds. One also wonders how the gun control nutbars square this with all of their screeching about how all of the crime in Illinois is due to criminals bringing in guns from other states. Although the sale and possession of new assault weapons is banned, existing owners can keep theirs as long as they register by the end of 2024, because they hate the Fourth Amendment as much as the Second. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that this is going to pass muster with the courts, especially after the Bruen decision last year. Sheriffs across Illinois have said that they will refuse to enforce the law, including DeKalb, Kankakee, McHenry, and LaSalle counties, saying they swore to protect constitutional rights and that this is a blatant Second Amendment violation. All 4 of those counties surround Cook County, so this should be interesting. It is refreshing to see police stand up for our constitutional rights, although in this case, maybe it's just because they don't want to be shot in the face. Governor J.B. Pritzker said, quote, "The assault weapons ban is the law of Illinois. Sheriffs have a constitutional duty to uphold the laws of the state, not pick and choose which laws they support and when." Yeah, they do. It's called discretion. But that doesn't even apply here. They have the duty, the obligation, not to support and enforce laws that go against the Constitution. How can you have a constitutional duty to disobey the Constitution? How does that even make linguistic sense? He also said, quote, "We're confident that this law will hold up to any further legal challenges." Dream on. So all of that makes the state of Illinois this week's biggest bogon emitter.
I want to tell you about the eyeglasses I've been wearing for years. As people can see on my videos, I have a very strong prescription, which makes glasses more expensive, especially when I need computer glasses, reading glasses, prescription sunglasses, and most expensively, progressive lenses for general everyday wear. To save money while still getting quality glasses, I get them from Firmoo. In fact, I just got a pair of progressives with high-index aspherical lenses and a nice pair of frames my wife loves for just over $100. It would have been $500 to get them through my eye doctor. Not only do they look good, the glasses are durable. I've worn many pairs for several years without problems. All orders come with a 30-day return policy, a 3-month warranty, and one-on-one customer service. Go to Firmoo, that's FIRMOO.Bogosity.tv anytime you need quality glasses at a low price. Once again, that's Firmoo.Bogosity.tv.
And now let's rectify this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
And this week it goes to Belarus for another idiotic copyright policy. President Alexander Lukashenko has signed into law the legalization of piracy of all movies, TV shows, and software owned by rights holders from, quote, unfriendly countries. IP-protected goods can also be imported from any country without permission. Belarus's support of Russia after the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War resulted in sanctions from the EU, US, UK, and other countries. So I guess everyone there can pirate The Mandalorian and Doctor Who with impunity. The law includes first-run movies and TV shows, shown on cinema screens and live streaming services. So basically, they can see Wakanda Forever for almost free. Are you starting to see the problem here? This means that people will be incentivized to watch content from unfriendly countries, which means they'll become more familiar with their culture and opinions, which just might not be what the dictatorial Belarusian government would want. I wonder if this applies to 3D printer scans as well. Are we gonna see Belarusians downloading the FGC9? Yeah, basically put this one in the what could possibly go wrong category. So all of that makes Belarus this week's
Idiot Extraordinaire.
Well, that wraps up this Who Produced This Schlock edition of the Bogosity Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please go to donate.bogosity.tv for several ways to support and discord.bogosity.tv to join the discussion. Subscribe at Patreon or Subscribestar, and you can listen early and ad-free. Thank you for listening. Until next time, here's a quote from Max Weber. In a democracy, the people choose a leader in whom they trust. Then the chosen leader says, "Now shut up and obey me." People and party are then no longer free to interfere in his business. The Bogosity Podcast is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.
Bogosity.
We live in a world where light bulbs connect to the internet, and recent attacks on them prove that your online security is under threat like never before. Not only your websites, but the internet-enabled devices you buy. And the biggest problem is weak passwords. That's why you need LastPass. LastPass allows you to randomly generate strong, unique passwords on the web and on your internet-enabled devices, all protected by one master password. LastPass sets up in minutes and gives you secure automatic logins throughout the web, synchronizing across all your browsers, all your computers, and even your mobile devices, at home, at work, or on the road. It even securely stores sensitive form data, including credit card numbers, backup sensitive documents, software licenses, Wi-Fi logins, and more. And with LastPass Premium, you can get these benefits on other applications, manage passwords for your entire family, and also get priority customer support. Sign up at password.bogosity.tv for a free month of LastPass Premium. Log in securely everywhere using the last password you'll ever have to remember. Go to password.bogosity.tv and get LastPass now.